When you're out shooting, you probably check your shots as you go. And if you're intentional about the settings that you've chosen, most of the time your exposure lands right where you want it. But there are situations, specific ones, where your exposure keeps coming out wrong and you can't quite explain the pattern. Here's what's actually happening. Your camera doesn't know what you're trying to shoot. It makes a calculation based on the whole scene if you're using evaluative metering. And in certain scenes, that calculation works against you every time. You may switch to spot metering, and sometimes it helps, but it's not the full answer. I ran into this constantly when shooting portraits for the last 13 years. But once I understood what the camera was actually measuring and why those specific moments break it, exposure stopped being a guessing game. And that's what this video is all about. The reason it keeps happening and the reason it feels random is that the camera is making a very specific calculation that most photographers have never been told about. Most of the time, your evaluative metering is remarkably accurate. Mixed scenes, average light, it works. And you've learned that. You've seen it land. You chimp, the exposure looks good, and you just keep going. And so that trust builds over time. But here's what's happening with those specific shots where the exposure meter shows you're in the right zone, but you end up with photos that are clearly wrong. You're not overriding your camera and you're not guessing because the meter confirmed you, but your photos were still wrong. And when it happens inconsistently, it feels like a fluke. But it's not a fluke and it's not random. There's a specific pattern to exactly which shots break it. And until you know the pattern, you'll keep walking into it at the worst moments because your camera is doing exactly what it's designed to do. But the problem is nobody told you what exactly it was designed to do. The worst moments aren't the ones where you're shooting in your backyard for practice. They're at the weddings where you're shooting a white dress, the snowy outdoor sessions, and backlit portraits where your subject looks perfect to your eye, but your results are completely wrong. So what is the camera actually calculating? What is it measuring? That's what we need to start with, because once you understand it, the whole pattern clicks at once. Most people assume that the meter is reading how bright the scene is, like a brightness sensor. And that seems logical. Bright scene, more light, the camera adjusts for it. But that's not what it's actually doing. Your camera meters reflected light off whatever's in the frame, and it's calibrated to expose everything. So the average comes out to about 18% gray, which is middle toned or medium brightness. But it doesn't know what your subject is. It doesn't know if your background is supposed to be a bright white or a deep black. It just sees light bounce off of everything and it averages it, and it tries to make that average look neutral. And in a typical scene where there's some lights, some darks, and some midtones, that average lands close to neutral and the exposure works. But the second your scene tips hard in one direction or the other, the camera starts fighting against what you're actually trying to shoot. A mostly bright scene, like white clothing or snow or a light colored backdrop, the camera is trying to darken it towards gray. And that's when your whites start to look really muddy and all the highlights disappear. And a mostly dark scene, like a black backdrop or dark clothing or a low-key setup, that's when the camera tries to brighten it towards gray. And your blacks in the photos start to lift and your shadows go gray when you wanted them dark. In a high contrast scene, like your subject against a bright background, the camera is trying to average for both and you lose one of them. I ran into this constantly when shooting portraits. I'd be shooting at golden hour and I'd set my subject in front of the setting sun because it was beautiful. And all of a sudden my subject was either well lit and the whole sunset disappeared, or I was getting the sunset in perfect focus and my subject's face was just too dark to see. If you don't know why this is happening, you end up fixing it in post every time, and you never understand why those scenes always need more exposure or less. But once you know, you can walk up to a bright background scene and you already know what the camera's gonna do before you press the shutter. So that's the principle, but which scenes actually trip this the most often? The ones you're actually going to be shooting. And if this is already making sense to you, do me a favor and hit like. It tells YouTube to show it to more photographers who need it. So once you know the 18% gray principle, the failure pattern stops feeling random. You can look at a scene and know whether the meter's gonna work with you or fight you. There are 3 types of scenes that usually get you, and you'll run into all 3 regularly. First is predominantly bright scenes. White clothing or snow, sand at the beach, a bright overcast sky filling the background, or white walls. The camera looks at all that brightness and decides it needs to bring everything down towards gray, and your whites go muddy and your image comes out underexposed, even though the meter said your exposure settings were right. And the second one is predominantly dark scenes. Dark backdrops, black fabric, subjects in dark clothing against dark walls, or night photography. The camera sees all that darkness and decides it needs to brighten it towards gray, and your blacks start to lift. And that's when a dark scene that should look moody and rich looks flat and gray. The third one, and this is the one that catches people most, is high contrast scenes, especially anything that's backlit, like having your subject in front of a bright window, or your subject with the sun behind them like I had, or a person in open shade with a bright sky filling the frame behind them. The camera tries to average the very bright background and your dark subject together, and you get a compromise that doesn't serve either one. Either the highlights in the sky get blown out and you get an underexposed subject, or you get a protected background and a subject's face that got lost in a shadow. But once you know these three things, you can see them coming. White dresses, beach sessions, window light portraits, outdoor backlit shoots. These are the most beautiful and sought after lighting situations that you'll ever shoot. And they're exactly the ones where the meter is working against you every single time if you don't know what to expect. I want to know which of these trips you up most. Drop it in the comments. Is it the bright backgrounds or the dark backgrounds or the backlit portrait situation? So you can see it coming now every time you shoot in a high contrast situation. But what do you actually do when you're standing in front of one of these scenes? The first instinct is to switch to spot metering. Aim the meter at your subject, problem solved. And it is better than evaluative in these situations. I'm not saying don't use it, but spot metering still runs on the 18% gray principle. It's just applying it to a smaller area. If you spot meter on a white dress, the camera still tries to make that dress 18% gray, and your dress goes gray, not white. And if you spot meter on the subject's face, you might nail the skin tones, but still lose the rest of the frame. And you have to know exactly where to put the spot and hit it consistently, which gets hard when you're moving fast. And it helps, but it's not the full answer. The tool that actually gives you control here is exposure compensation and knowing which direction to push it based on the scene. In a bright dominant scene, you want to add exposure, which is positive compensation. At least 1, sometimes 1.3 or more, depending on how much white fills the frame. But in a darkly dominant scene, pull back. You want to add a negative compensation here, like -1 or -1.3 to keep your blacks where they belong. And in a high contrast or backlit situation, you have to make a deliberate choice here. Do you expose for your subject, which lets the bright background blow out? Or do you protect the background, which darkens the subject? One of them wins, and that's not a mistake, that's a decision. In manual mode, you're doing the same thing. You're just dialing the compensation indirectly through your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO instead of a dial. I'll be honest with you, once I understood this, it didn't make me a perfect in-camera photographer. I still edited a lot in post. This is the do as I say and not as I do moment. And this isn't about being technically perfect. It's about stopping the guessing. When you know the pattern and you know which direction to correct, you stop taking 5 test shots hoping one comes out right. You start close, and starting close is different from starting from scratch every time. If you want a quick reference for exposure settings in the situations you run into most, I have a free guide called Shoot Like a Pro. It's manual mode recipes for the most common shooting scenarios. Grab it from the link in the description and have it on hand the next time you go out to shoot. You know what the camera is actually doing, and it's not trying to capture your scene accurately. It's trying to normalize it. And the meter isn't broken. It was designed this way. And once you know that, you can work with it instead of against it. That said, knowing the principle and reading the results on the back of your camera are 2 separate things. Your histogram will tell you if your compensation actually landed or whether you still need to adjust it. And a lot of photographers look at histograms and have no idea what they're seeing. That might be the next thing we need to cover. What the histogram actually tells you and how to read it in the moment. Shoot Like a Pro is in the description, and if you haven't grabbed it yet, start there.